By 6 p.m., your discipline is usually not gone by accident. You were useful at 9 a.m. You answered messages, picked clothes, decided what to eat, what to reply to, what to postpone. Now you open the important email, stare at it too long, and feel a stupid amount of resistance to typing one clear sentence. You tell yourself you will start in 10 minutes. Then you order food instead of cooking. This pattern has a name: decision fatigue, with choice overload sitting right beside it. Roy Baumeister's self-control research helped popularize the idea that repeated regulation changes later performance, even if the simple fuel tank version, often called ego depletion, is still debated. What you do not know, in that moment, is that this may not be a moral failure at all. It may be a control system doing exactly what it does after too many choices, too much filtering, and too many small acts of restraint. The real problem may be that your most important work keeps arriving after that system has already been taxed. If your discipline crashes at the same hour again and again, what is actually getting worn down across the day? Decision fatigue is the drop in decision quality and effort after repeated choosing. The control network most involved is the prefrontal cortex, the part that helps you hold a goal in mind, ignore distractions, and stop the first impulse. Working memory matters here too. It keeps current rules active, but it is limited, so every open option and unresolved task adds load. Choice overload adds a second problem. In research summarized by psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper, more options can reduce follow-through instead of improving it. The popular JAR study is often simplified, but the broader effect is well documented. More choices can increase friction and reduce action. That system evolved for environments where choices were fewer, stakes were clearer, and cues were not arriving every minute. In digital life, you do not just make big decisions. You triage notifications, switch tabs, suppress the urge to check your phone, and re-enter tasks after interruptions. Each act asks for goal maintenance, conflict monitoring, and effort. The exact ego depletion model remains contested in the literature, but the practical pattern is harder to dismiss. Repeated regulation can change later persistence, judgment, and default behavior. That is what is at stake by evening. This is where the self-blame starts. The crash feels personal because the final failure is visible, but the buildup is not. The buildup is small. You choose breakfast while reading messages. You decide whether to answer now or later. You inhibit the urge to check one app, then another. You switch from a spreadsheet to chat, then back, and each switch leaves a residue researchers call attention residue, documented by Sophie Leroy. Part of your focus is still stuck on the last thing. Across the day, that means your control system is not only making choices. It is also reopening loops, holding rules in mind, and suppressing easier actions. In classic work by Baumeister and colleagues, people who had already exerted self-control often performed worse on later persistence tasks. The exact explanation is still argued over. Replication debates matter here, but the broad observation fits daily life and converges with other lines of evidence. Repeated regulation changes what people do next. By evening, the brain often shifts toward the familiar, the immediate, and the low-friction option. That is not mysterious. Habits cost less effort than deliberate control. Defaults reduce load. Delay feels harder because the task itself has not changed, but the system needed to start it has less room to work. Discipline fails after too many choices. That is why a simple message can feel heavier at 6 p.m. than a harder task felt at 9 a.m. So the question is no longer whether your discipline disappeared. The question is what repeated choice does to behavior, and what kind of evidence shows that small decisions can bend an entire day. One of the clearest real-world examples came from a study by Shai Danziger, Jonathan Leviv, and Liora Avnaim-Peso on judicial decisions in Israel. Across decision sessions, favorable parole rulings were much more common after breaks and then declined as the session went on, before rising again after the next break. The study has limits, and it does not prove a single drained substance in the brain. Researchers have debated the interpretation, but it is a strong illustration of something familiar. After repeated decisions, people often drift toward the easier default. For a judge, the default can be maintaining the current state. For you at 6 p.m., it can be leaving the draft unopened, reheating the same food, scrolling instead of planning, saying tomorrow because tomorrow costs less right now. The important detail is that the final choice looks personal, but the pressure pushing it was built hours earlier. But there is a detail almost everyone misses. The damage is not only done by dramatic decisions. It is also done by the pileup of tiny unresolved ones. Which message first? Which tab now? Save this for later or clear it. Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper's work on choice overload points in that direction. More options do not always improve action. Sometimes they increase friction and reduce follow-through. So even before the hard task arrives, the system that should start it has already spent the day sorting, filtering, and delaying. Now zoom out. A year sounds large until you convert it into weeks. A human life of 80 years is about 4,000 weeks. If your most important work keeps landing in the hour when decision load is highest, then a bad evening is not just a bad evening. It is a repeated placement error. The visible 6 p.m. crash is often the endpoint of accumulated load. Notifications, unfinished tasks, context switches, small choices that never looked important on their own. By dinner, even choosing which document to open can feel heavier than the work inside it. And when that happens often enough, the schedule turns into a story about who you are. Martin Seligman's learned helplessness research is not a one-to-one model for office work, but it is a careful parallel. When repeated failure feels detached from its real cause, initiation drops. People stop acting because effort stops seeming useful. That is how a timing problem becomes a character verdict. You remember the nights you bailed, not the mornings you were fully capable. So if your brain learned a daily pattern and then built an identity around it, what would change if you redesigned the pattern instead of attacking yourself? The turn is simple. What gets worn down is not your worth. It is your ability to keep choosing, filtering impulses, and holding priorities steady after a day of friction. That is why the fix has to target the system around the behavior, not just the behavior. The brain changes with repetition. That is neuroplasticity. In plain terms, it learns the pattern you run often. If every evening is full of open options, alerts, and last-minute deciding, then the late-day pattern being reinforced is hesitation, defaulting, and avoidance. Willpower inside that setup is forced to work at the exact moment the focus system has the least spare capacity. A better design changes the job the brain has to do. First, fewer live choices reduce load on the prefrontal cortex, the part handling goal maintenance and restraint. If dinner is already decided, clothes are already set, and work blocks are fixed, there is less active control needed later. Second, pre-commitment shifts the burden earlier. Behavioral economics and decision research use that term for choosing in advance, so the harder moment requires less deciding. A calendar block, a website blocker, or a planned start location turns a future decision into a present rule. Third, stable cues let behavior run with less moment-to-moment supervision. This is the logic behind habit research associated with Wendy Wood. Repeated behavior in a stable context becomes more automatic and less dependent on active deliberation. That matters because automatic does not mean mindless. It means the action costs less control. The same is true for open loops. One capture list, one defined next action, one planned starting point reduce the need to keep re-evaluating. You are not trying to become more virtuous at 6 p.m. You are reducing the number of choices that 6 p.m. demands. Once that clicks, the practical shift is clear. Stop asking your most tired decision state to rescue the day. Start with the environment. Remove trivial decisions before they appear. Use repeatable breakfasts or lunches. Keep a small clothing rotation for workdays. Set fixed blocks for focused work. Limit notifications to scheduled checks. Create a shutdown rule for the end of the workday so loose tasks are captured instead of carried. This is not aesthetic minimalism. It is decision hygiene. Each default protects the focus system from spending itself on low-value choices. Then place important work earlier, before choice load stacks up. If that is impossible, protect it with pre-commitment. Decide the exact start time, exact file, and exact first action in advance. Not work on project. Open this document. Write this paragraph. Review these lines. A vague task creates new choices at the worst time. A defined start point removes them. Then fix the identity error. Stop reading the evening slump as proof that you are lazy or weak. The record supports a simpler reading. You are sending meaningful work into a biologically expensive time slot and expecting clean judgment from a system already crowded by decisions, interruptions, and open loops. The problem was not character. It was placement and load. So the line resolves cleanly. Discipline fails after too many choices. Not because discipline is fake, and not because you are broken. Your discipline was dying by 6 p.m. because the day kept spending it before the work that mattered arrived. That is why the evening resistance felt so personal and was mostly mechanical. You are not someone whose discipline disappears at night. You are someone who can work well when the day is designed to ask less constant choosing. If this changed how you see your evenings, the next one goes deeper. This is a scheduling and systems problem, not a character flaw.